So we've been talking about the scientific process and what science is good for, what science does, how is it important for our lives. But science is a very powerful thing. But there's an important question we have to ask: Is science the only thing, or is the science the only way to figure out what is true about the world? Are there things that are true that science cannot measure? And this is an important question, especially for the larger society and things like that. So I want to discuss something, a view of science out there called scientism. And what scientism says is that it's a belief that science is the only way to find out facts about reality. Someone might say who believes in scientism, they might say, well, I don't believe in anything unless it can be scientifically proven. And so it's this idea that science has no limits in what it can discover. And really, what I'm going to argue here is that this is an overreach of science. Science is not something that can explain everything about the world. It can't explain everything that's true. So science does have limits, and that's what I'm going to argue here today. As I said, scientism is almost certainly false, and there's a couple of reasons that we can talk about here as to why that is. So this is something to think about, right? Try to think of something, and you can pause the video if you want. Try to think of something that science can measure, and things like the weight of something, or how tall something is, or the acidity of something, or something like that. Now, think of all those things that it can measure, but we're going to think of the things that it can't measure. So the limits of science here. Science is limited by what it can measure. So, for example, if I had a camera that could only see red light. So just imagine a camera that's like a normal camera, but it cannot see anything that is not red. Is it okay for me to look at the footage from this camera and say and conclude, well, I can't see anything green, so therefore nothing green exists? Well, what you would say to me is, Mr. Queering, you didn't see green things not because green things don't exist, but because you used a measurement tool that cannot see green things. And so the only reason that you couldn't see it was because your camera cannot actually see it in the way it functions. So science at its very base measures four things. It measures time, it measures space, it measures matter, and it measures energy, which means that science can only draw conclusions about these four things because those are the only four things that it can measure. Here's an easy trick to decide if something is measurable by science. Ask yourself, how much does blank weigh? So, for example, if someone says that science has proven that there is no purpose to existence, ask yourself, okay, well, how much does purpose weigh? And as you can tell, that question makes no sense. And the reason why that question makes no sense is because science cannot measure purpose. Science doesn't measure how meaningful your life is or anything like that, because how meaningful your life is not something that is dependent on time. It's not space, it's not matter, it's not energy. This is your feelings, this is your experience that happens in your own brain. And science has no hope of drawing conclusions about things like purpose and meaning because it cannot even come close to measuring those things. So if the question doesn't make sense, as the one we discussed does not, it's probably not measurable by science. Here's another example. How much does goodness weigh? How can we even measure goodness? It's not something that we can even wrap our minds around because it's not possible. So there are several things that cannot be scientifically proven, right, that we are still rational in believing. So, for example, there are lots of things that are true out there that cannot be scientifically proven. So, for example, good and evil. Things are really good and other things are really evil, but we can't do a scientific experiment to determine whether something was good or evil. Mathematics, logic, things like that. The fact that 2 + 2 = 4. these things are not scientifically provable because they're not natural things. There's not like the number two sitting out there on Mount Everest somewhere that we can go and put in the laboratory and examine with an experiment. Mathematics are just ideas, and the ideas are things that are assumed to be true in the case of mathematics that can't be scientifically proven. Beauty, you can't measure how beautiful something is. That's your opinion. Um, Purpose and meaning, we've talked about that before. Intentionality, we can talk about cake here in a second. And science itself cannot be scientifically proven because that would be arguing in a circle. So, all of these things are things that are definitely true about the world, right? There's definitely beauty, there's definitely good and evil. Science definitely exists. These are all things that are true, but they are not things that are scientifically provable. The reason why science, for example, is not scientifically provable, you can't use science to prove science, is because science has assumptions that it operates on. So, an assumption is a thing that's accepted as true without proof. So, for example, most of you sat down in a chair today and you just assumed that that chair would hold you up. You didn't check the chair to make sure no one had broken it or something like that. You just sat down knowing that it would, or assuming that it would hold you up. Now, science assumes various things that cannot be proven scientifically. So, for example, in order to even do science, you have to assume the truth of logical and mathematical things, right? You have to assume that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that 4 divided by 2 is 2, and all of these sorts of things. You have to assume them to be true before you can even do science. You have to also assume that you are not the only mind in the universe. Science is a thing where you don't do all the research that has ever been done, right? You learn from people who have also done experiments, and in order to accept what people are telling you, you have to assume that they have minds, that those minds exist, and things like that. You also assume that the universe was not created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. Once again, this is kind of a funny idea, but this is something that cannot be disproven. At the same time, it's still ridiculous to believe. And you have to believe that the world is real. Like, for example, we're not in the Matrix, we're not in a simulation or something like that, right? You have to assume all of these sorts of things in order for science to operate. One of the biggest assumptions of science is that nature will keep behaving the same way now and into the future. So, for example, if you drop a pencil and it falls to the ground, you have to kind of assume that the next time you drop the pencil, it's also going to fall to the ground and gravity is going to pull it down and things like that. It's not like we live in a universe where 1 second you drop the pencil, the next second when you drop the pencil, it goes up instead of down, right? So science is built on this idea that nature will keep behaving the same way now and into the future, and we can do experiments to figure out how it is that it works. So thanks for watching, and hopefully you've been able to come up with some reasons that science can't explain everything.